Welcome back to our channel. Today, we're journeying back in time to the heart of ancient Rome to witness the birth of a boy who would one day become one of its most infamous emperors. This is the story of Nero, but his tale begins not with imperial purple, but with a different name altogether. On a cold December morning in 37 CE, in the seaside town of Antium, a child was born. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. He was not born in a palace, but his veins flowed with the bluest of blood. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was a man of considerable wealth and consular rank, known for his brutish and often violent temperament. But it was his mother who would truly shape his destiny. His mother was Agrippina the Younger, a woman of formidable ambition and impeccable lineage. She was the great-granddaughter of the first Roman emperor, Augustus himself, and the sister of the reigning emperor, Caligula. From the moment Lucius was born, Agrippina saw not just a son, but a key that could unlock the ultimate power in Rome. She was a master of political maneuvering, a survivor in the treacherous courts of the Caesars, and she instilled in her son a sense of entitlement and destiny from his earliest days. Imagine the world this child was born into, the Julio Claudian dynasty. The family that had transformed the Roman Republic into an empire was a web of intrigue, power plays, and alliances. Through his mother, Lucius was directly connected to this legendary bloodline. He was a descendant of Augustus, the founder of the empire, and through his grandmother, Antonia the Younger, he was also the great-nephew of the Emperor Tiberius. This wasn't just a family tree, it was a roadmap to the throne. At the time of his birth, however, the path was far from clear. The emperor was his uncle, the unpredictable Caligula. No one could have predicted the dramatic twists of fate that would catapult this young boy, Lucius, from the relative obscurity of a noble's son to the pinnacle of Roman power. Agrippina, however, was always watching, always planning. Her ambition was a relentless fire, and her son was the fuel she would use to set the Roman world ablaze. She knew that in Rome, power wasn't just inherited, it was set. The early years of Lucius's life were marked by turmoil. When he was just 2 years old, his uncle Caligula, in a fit of paranoia, exiled Agrippina to a remote island, accusing her of plotting against him. Young Lucius was sent to live with his paternal aunt, Domitia Lepida, a woman who, by some accounts, was far less nurturing. He was raised in relative poverty, his inheritance seized by the emperor. This period of hardship, away from his mother's influence, would have a profound impact on his development. Then, in 41 CE, the political landscape of Rome was violently Caligula, whose reign had descended into tyranny, was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. In the ensuing chaos, a new emperor was unexpectedly proclaimed. Claudius, Caligula's uncle and a man long considered an unlikely candidate for the throne. For Agrippina, this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. With Caligula gone, her exile was ended. She returned to Rome, a woman hardened by her experience, but more determined than ever. Reunited with her son Lucius, Agrippina immediately began to weave her web. She was a prominent figure in the imperial court, and she used her beauty, intelligence, and family connections to her full advantage. She knew that to secure her son's future, she needed to get closer to the center of power, and there was no one more central than the emperor himself. Claudius was her uncle, but in the complex marital politics of the Julio Claudians, that was hardly an obstacle. In the years that followed, Agrippina masterfully positioned herself. After the execution of Claudius's third wife, Messalina, for treason, the position of empress was vacant. Agrippina outmaneuvered her rivals, and, despite the controversy of marrying her own uncle, she became Claudius's fourth wife in 49 CE. This was the masterstroke. Overnight, she went from being a powerful noblewoman to the Empress of Rome, and more importantly, her son, Lucius, was now the stepson of the emperor. The boy, once known as Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, was about to undergo a transformation. Agrippina persuaded Claudius to formally adopt her son, giving him precedence over Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. In 50 Lucius was officially adopted, and his name was changed forever. He became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. The name Nero was a prestigious one in the Claudian family, a name that resonated with history and power. He was no longer just a child of the dynasty. He was now the designated heir. From this point on, Nero's education and public image were meticulously crafted by his mother. He was placed under the tutelage of one of the most brilliant minds in Rome, the Stoic philosopher Seneca. He was trained in rhetoric, music, and the arts, groomed to be a cultured and capable ruler. Agrippina ensured he was constantly in the public eye, awarded honors and titles that far surpassed his young age. She was building his resume, constructing the image of a perfect prince. But beneath this carefully polished exterior, the currents of ambition and resentment ran deep. The imperial court was a nest of vipers. Britannicus, the emperor's natural son, remained a rival, a constant reminder that Nero's position was not entirely secure. Agrippina's control over her son was absolute, but as Nero grew into a teenager, flickers of an independent, and perhaps more sinister, will began to show. The stage was now set. A boy born Lucius, molded by his mother's relentless ambition, and renamed Nero, stood on the precipice of ultimate power. He was a product of the Julio Claudian dynasty in every sense entitled by blood, shaped by intrigue, and destined for a throne that carried both supreme authority and a deadly curse. The death of Claudius in 54 CE would be the final, decisive act in this chapter of his life, a death that many historians, both ancient and modern, lay at the feet of his ambitious wife, Agrippina. And so, at the tender age of 16, Nero became the emperor of Rome. The child of the dynasty had finally claimed his birthright, but the story of his reign, a tale of artistic passion, immense popularity, and unspeakable cruelty, was only just beginning. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the early life of Nero. It's a fascinating story of ambition, politics, and power. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button, and do you not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next chapter in our series. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our series on the extraordinary women of Rome. In our last chapter, we left Agrippina the Younger as a survivor, a woman who had navigated the treacherous courts of her brother Caligula and returned from exile. But survival was never enough for Agrippina. She was born to rule, and now we witnessed her calculated, brilliant, and ruthless ascent to the pinnacle of Roman power. This is the story of how a woman, in a world dominated by men, bent the Roman Empire to her will. Agrippina returned to a Rome ruled by her uncle, Claudius. She was a widow, a single mother, but she was also the great-granddaughter of Augustus. This lineage was her greatest asset, a currency more valuable than gold. She knew that in Rome, marriage wasn't about love. It was about power, alliances, and strategic positioning. Her first move was a masterful one. She married Gaius Sallustius Crispus Passienus, a wealthy and influential senator. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a restatement of her status. It provided her with immense wealth and brought her back into the heart of Roman high society. Crispus was respected, connected, and twice consul. By marrying him, Agrippina wasn't just gaining a husband, she was acquiring a platform, resources, and a shield. This marriage stabilized her position and gave her the financial independence she needed to begin her real Game of Thrones. She was no longer just the disgraced sister of a dead emperor. She was a major power player in her own right, quietly observing, planning, and waiting for the right moment to strike. Every move Agrippina made was a calculated step on a ladder leading to one place: the imperial throne, not for herself, not directly, but for her son Nero. She saw in him the future of the Julio Claudian dynasty, and more importantly, the instrument of her own authority. After Crispus's convenient death, which some ancient historians whisper was not entirely natural, Agrippina inherited his vast fortune. Now, she was not only of imperial blood but also one of the wealthiest individuals in Rome. Her ambition was no longer a secret. She began to build a network of allies within the Senate and the Praetorian Guard. She used her charm, her intelligence, and her wealth to cultivate loyalty. She understood that power in Rome didn't just reside in the emperor's palace. It was spread across the city, in the barracks of the guards and the villas of the powerful. She was playing a long game, patiently arranging the pieces on the board, preparing for the moment the current empress, the infamous Messalina, would inevitably falter. And falter she did. The downfall of Messalina in 48 AD was the opportunity Agrippina had been waiting for. Messalina's scandalous public marriage to a senator while still married to Claudius was a step too far, even for Rome. Her execution created a power vacuum at the emperor's side, and several women vied to fill it, but Agrippina had an advantage no one else could match. She was Claudius's niece. The idea of an uncle marrying his niece was shocking, a taboo, but Agrippina was a master of political theater. She leveraged her allies to argue the case in the Senate, framing the union not as an impropriety, but as a patriotic duty of marriage that would unite the two remaining branches of the Julio Claudian family, ensuring stability for the empire. It was a brilliant piece of public relations. The Senate, under pressure from Agrippina's supporters, and likely a few well-placed bribes, passed a special law to permit the marriage. In 49 AD, Agrippina the Younger became Empress of Rome. She had reached the summit. Now as Empress Agrippina, moved with breathtaking speed and efficiency. Her primary goal was to secure the succession for her son, Nero, over Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus, within a year of her marriage. In 50 AD, she persuaded the aging Claudius to formally adopt Nero. He was now Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, no longer, but Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus. The name change was everything. It made him an official heir, placing him on equal footing with, and arguably ahead of, the younger Britannicus. Agrippina didn't stop there. She secured the best tutor in the empire for her son, the philosopher Seneca. She also ensured her ally, Sextus Afranius Burrus, was appointed as the sole prefect of the Praetorian Guard. This was the Praetorians were the emperor's bodyguards, the only military force in the city. With Burrus in command, she controlled the men with the swords. She had the intellectual guidance of Seneca, shaping her son's public image, and the military might of the Praetorians, guaranteeing his security. As Empress, Agrippina wasn't content to be a mere consort. She ruled. She was the first empress to be granted the honorific title of Augusta during her husband's lifetime. She attended Senate meetings, hidden behind a curtain, listening and influencing debates. Her face appeared on coinage alongside Claudius's, an unprecedented honor that signaled her status as a queen. She managed imperial finances, received foreign delegations, and founded a colony in her German birthplace, which she named Colonia. Claudia Era Agrippinensium. She was effectively the acting emperor, with Claudius often deferring to her sharp intellect and political acumen. She had methodically removed her rivals, including Britannicus's key supporters, and replaced them with men loyal to her and to Nero. The entire power structure of Rome was being rebuilt around her son. B. 53. The stage was almost set. To cement Nero's position, Agrippina arranged his marriage to Claudius's daughter Octavia, who was also Britannicus's sister. This final act tied Nero directly to Claudius by blood and marriage, marginalizing Britannicus completely. Nero was now the son-in-law, and the designated heir. Agrippina's plan was nearing its climax. She had neutralized all threats, secured the loyalty of the army, and placed her son in an unassailable position. All that remained was the final piece of the puzzle, the removal of Claudius himself. The emperor was growing older, and there were whispers that he was beginning to regret his decisions, and was starting to favor his own son, Britannicus. Once more, for Agrippina, this was an unacceptable risk. She had worked too long and too hard to let her grand design crumble at the last moment. The power she had so carefully constructed for her son and for herself had to be secured permanently. And so, in the year 54 AD, Emperor Claudius died after eating a meal. Ancient sources, most notably Tacitus, are nearly unanimous in their verdict. He was poisoned, and the plate of delicious mushrooms was served by the hand, or at least at the command, of his wife, Agrippina. While we can never be 100% certain, the timing was just too perfect. Immediately following Claudius's death, Burrus presented Nero to the Praetorian Guard, who, already primed and paid, hailed him as the new emperor. The Senate, facing a fait accompli, had no choice but to ratify the decision. At just 16 years old, Nero was the master of the Roman world. But everyone knew who held the real power. Agrippina had done it. She had overcome exile, scandal, and the rigid patriarchy of Rome to place her son on the throne. She had risen from a political outcast to the most powerful woman in the world. She was the mother of the emperor, the Augusta, the de facto ruler of the empire. But as we'll see in our next chapter, holding on to power can be even more dangerous than acquiring it, especially when the son you created decides he no longer wants to be a puppet. Thank you so much for joining me for this part of Agrippina's incredible story. If you're fascinated by the power plays of ancient Rome, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you do you and miss the dramatic conclusion to her tale. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Hello history lovers, and welcome back to our deep dive into the life of Nero. Last time, we saw how his ambitious mother Agrippina maneuvered him into the line of succession. Today, in Chapter 3, we explore the making of an emperor, the education and early years of a boy who was being molded for absolute power. What kind of education does a future Roman emperor receive? Let's find out. With Claudius on the throne and Nero now his adopted son, Agrippina knew the next crucial step was to shape her son into a worthy successor. She spared no expense, assembling a team of the finest minds in Rome to educate the young prince. This wasn't just about reading and writing. This was about crafting a ruler. At the head of this all-star academic team was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, a name that echoes through the halls of philosophy. Seneca was a leading Stoic philosopher, a brilliant writer, and a renowned statesman who had been recalled from exile specifically for this task. Imagine having one of the greatest thinkers of the age as your personal tutor. Seneca's job was to instill in Nero the Stoic virtues: wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. He taught Nero rhetoric, the art of public speaking, which was essential for any Roman leader who needed to command the Senate and inspire the people. He also guided him through the vast world of literature and moral philosophy, hoping to build a foundation of ethical leadership. Alongside Seneca was another key figure, Sextus Afranius. Burrus was the tough, no-nonsense prefect of the Praetorian Guard. He wasn't a philosopher. He was a soldier and an administrator. His role was to teach Nero the practical side of ruling, military strategy, state administration, and the importance of maintaining the loyalty of the army. Burrus was the pragmatist to Seneca's idealist. Together, they formed a powerful duo, a brains and brawn combination, meant to provide Nero with a perfectly balanced education. One taught him how to think like a philosopher king, the other how to act like a commander-in-chief. Nero's curriculum was incredibly diverse. He studied Greek and Latin literature, immersing himself in the epic poems of Homer and Virgil. He was trained in music, learning to play the lyre and to sing, pursuits that were considered refined for a Roman aristocrat, but would later become a source of controversy. He also engaged in sports and horsemanship, including chariot racing, which he absolutely loved. This education was designed to create a cultured and capable leader, a stark contrast to the scholarly but socially awkward Claudius. So, how did Nero respond to all this? By all accounts, he was a bright and enthusiastic student, at least in certain subjects. He had a genuine passion for the arts. He loved poetry, music, and performance. He would spend hours practicing the lyre, and his tutors noted his natural flair for the dramatic. This artistic sensibility would become a defining feature of his reign, for better and for worse. He absorbed Seneca's lessons on rhetoric, becoming a skilled and persuasive speaker, able to charm and captivate an audience. However, there were already signs that Seneca's philosophical teachings weren't quite hitting the mark. While Nero enjoyed the beauty of poetry, he showed little interest in the more rigorous and disciplined aspects of Stoic philosophy. The concepts of self-denial, emotional control, and duty seemed to bore him. He was more drawn to the glamour, the performance, and the applause. Seneca tried to teach him moderation, but Nero was already developing a taste for luxury and He was charming, yes, but also impulsive and increasingly arrogant. Early anecdotes from his youth paint a picture of a complex personality. On one hand, he could display moments of surprising compassion. There is a famous story where he was asked to sign a death warrant for a criminal and exclaimed, "I wish I had never learned to write." This suggests a reluctance to inflict harm, a flicker of the humanity Seneca hoped to nurture. But on the other hand, there were darker signs. He could be vain, his ally flattered, and quick to anger when he didn't get his way. He developed a competitive streak that sometimes veered into cruelty, especially if he felt upstaged. He was a young man caught between the high-minded ideals of his teacher and the intoxicating reality of his own immense privilege. His relationship with his mother, Agrippina, was also becoming more complicated. While she was the architect of his rise, she was also an overwhelmingly controlling presence. She monitored his every move, chose his friends, and dictated his schedule. As Nero entered his teenage years, this maternal control began to chafe. He started seeking outlets for his own will, often in his artistic pursuits, which his mother viewed as frivolous distractions from the serious business of politics. This growing tension between a power-hungry mother and a son, yearning for independence, would set the stage for one of history's most infamous family dramas. So, we see a young Nero on the cusp of power. He's been given the best education money and influence could buy. He is armed with the eloquence of a poet, the training of a statesman, and the instincts of a performer. But within him, a battle is raging. Will he become the just and wise ruler that Seneca envisions? Or will his vanity, impulsiveness, and love of spectacle lead him down a different, much darker path? The foundation has been laid, but the final structure is far from certain. The boy who was trained to be a philosopher king was also a boy who loved the roar of the crowd, and that love would come to define his destiny. That's all for this chapter. The stage is now set for Nero's ascension. Join me next time as we witness the moment he finally takes the throne and the 5 good years of his reign begin. What happens when this oddest prince is handed the keys to the world's greatest empire? You won't want to miss it. Thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying the series, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter in the epic story of Nero. See you next time. Welcome back to our series, where we're peeling back the layers of Roman history, one emperor at a time. Today, we delve into a chapter filled with shadows, whispers, and the unmistakable scent of poison hanging in the palace air. We've arrived at chapter 4, Poison at the Palace. The year is 54 AD. Emperor Claudius, a man who survived the treacherous reigns of his predecessors against all odds, is dead. He was 63 years old, and while he had his ailments, the suddenness of his demise sent shockwaves through the empire. The official story. He died after eating a dish of his favorite mushrooms. A simple, almost mundane end for an emperor. But in Rome, nothing is ever that simple. Immediately, the rumor mill began to churn, and one name was on everyone's lips. Agrippina, the younger, Claudius's wife, his niece, and a woman whose ambition knew no bounds. Was it merely a tragic coincidence, or was it a perfectly executed plan? Let's look at the players and the motives. Agrippina had spent years securing her position and, more importantly, the position of her son, Nero. She had convinced Claudius to adopt Nero, pushing aside his own biological son, Britannicus, in the line of succession. With Claudius alive, Britannicus was a constant threat. He was getting older, closer to coming of age, and many Romans saw him as the rightful heir. For Agrippina, the clock was ticking. If Claudius changed his mind or if Britannicus gained enough support, all her carefully laid plans would crumble. The emperor's death, at that precise moment, was incredibly convenient for her. The ancient sources, like Tacitus and Suetonius, paint a vivid and chilling picture. They allege that Agrippina, a master of courtly intrigue, enlisted the help of a notorious poisoner named Locusta. The poison was said to have been administered on that fatal plate of mushrooms. Some accounts even add another layer to the plot. They claim that when the initial dose didn't work quickly enough, Claudius's own, Dr. Xenophon, finished the job by tickling the emperor's throat with a feather dipped in a fast-acting poison under the guise of helping him vomit. A feather, a common tool for inducing vomiting after a rich Roman feast, turned into a murder weapon. It's a gruesome detail that highlights the treachery of the imperial court. Of course, we must remember that these historians were writing decades after the events, and they were often hostile to the imperial family. They loved a good story. And what's better than a tale of a conniving empress and a poisoned emperor? But the circumstantial evidence is compelling. Agrippina immediately moved to secure the throne for her son, while the palace was in lockdown, with the news of Claudius's death kept secret. She made sure the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, were on her side. Promises were made, and gold was paid. So, when the palace doors finally opened, it wasn't Britannicus who was presented to the guards and the people. It was a 16-year-old boy, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, now known to the world as Nero. On October 13th, 54 AD, the Praetorian Guard hailed him as their new leader. The Senate, facing a done deal, had no choice but to confirm it. Who's like that a teenager was the most powerful man in the known world? Nero's ascension was a masterpiece of political maneuvering, orchestrated entirely by his mother. In the early days of his reign, her face even appeared alongside his on Roman coins, a symbol of her unprecedented power and influence. She had achieved her ultimate goal. Her son was emperor. She believed she would be the true power behind the throne, guiding the young, inexperienced boy. But Agrippina would soon learn a hard lesson. A snake, once grown, can bite the hand that raised it. The poison that brought her son to power had also sown the seeds of her own destruction. Nero, the boy she had molded, was about to become a man, and his reign would be one of the most infamous in all of history. The stage was set for a new era of ambition, paranoia, and bloodshed. The death of Claudius remains one of history's great cold cases. Was it natural causes, a tragic accident, or cold-blooded murder? The truth is likely lost to time, buried under centuries of political spin and sensationalism. But one thing is certain: his death paved the way for an emperor whose name would become synonymous with tyranny and excess. The age of Nero had begun. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the heart of the Roman Empire. The story is far from over, and the next chapter promises even more drama and intrigue. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss what comes next. Hit that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next episode. Welcome back to our journey through the life of Nero. Today, we're diving into Chapter 5, the early years of promise. You might think you know Nero, the tyrant, the fiddler while Rome burned. But what if I told you that wasn't the whole story? What if, in the beginning, he was seen as a beacon of hope, a golden boy destined to lead Rome into a new era of prosperity? Stick around, because this chapter of his life might just change everything you thought you knew. The year is 54. The Emperor Claudius is dead, and a young man, not yet 17, steps onto the public stage. This is Nero, and his first appearances are nothing short of spectacular. He addresses the Senate, his words carefully crafted and brimming with promise. He speaks of a return to the principles of Augustus, of respecting the Senate's authority, and of ruling with clemency and justice. He presents himself not as an absolute master, but as a first citizen among equals. Imagine the relief and optimism sweeping through Rome after the unpredictable reigns of Caligula and Claudius. Here was a young, eloquent, and seemingly humble emperor promising a brighter future. His speeches were masterpieces of political communication, filled with pledges to end secret trials, reject the corruption of flatterers, and govern with transparency. Rome was captivated. But was this young man truly the architect of this new golden age? The truth is, he had some powerful help. Behind the throne stood a formidable triumvirate: his mother, Agrippina the Younger, his tutor, the brilliant philosopher Seneca, and the stern, loyal commander of the Praetorian Guard, Sextus Afranius Burrus. For the first 5 years of Nero's reign, this trio guided the ship of state. Agrippina, ambitious and ruthless, had orchestrated her son's rise to power and intended to rule through him. She was the ultimate political operator. Seneca, a Stoic philosopher of immense intellect, sought to mold Nero into a virtuous and just ruler, a true philosopher. And Bruce, the military man, ensured the loyalty of the army and managed the practical, day-to-day administration of the empire with unwavering efficiency. Together, they formed a check-and-balance system, with Seneca and Bruce often working to counteract Agrippina's more extreme ambitions. This period became known as the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years of Nero. It was a time of stability and competent governance, largely thanks to these 3 figures steering the young emperor. The promises Nero made weren't just empty words. His early reign saw a wave of popular and genuinely beneficial reforms. One of the first things he did was tackle the tax system. He cracked down on the greed of tax collectors, who often exploited citizens for personal gain. He even proposed a radical idea, abolishing all indirect taxes throughout the empire. While this proved too ambitious and was ultimately blocked by the Senate, who feared a collapse of state revenue, it showcased a ruler who was genuinely concerned with the financial burden on his people. Instead, he implemented more moderate reforms, like making tax regulations public so citizens knew exactly what they owed and couldn't be cheated. His generosity wasn't limited to Rome. When provinces suffered from disasters, Nero was quick to provide aid. He personally funded rebuilding efforts in cities struck by earthquakes and offered financial assistance to communities in need. He seemed to understand that the strength of the empire depended on the well-being of all its parts, not just the capital. This benevolent approach won him immense popularity far and wide. People saw him as a protector, a ruler who cared. Perhaps most striking was his reputation for mercy. There's a famous story from this time that perfectly illustrates this. When presented with a death warrant for a condemned criminal, Nero reportedly hesitated and sighed, "Quam velem necidi literis." How I wish I did not know how to write. This single, poignant remark, whether genuine or a calculated performance, spread like wildfire. It painted the picture of a ruler who felt the weight of his power, a young man who recoiled from bloodshed. He pardoned political opponents, limited the scope of treason laws that his predecessors had used to eliminate rivals, and often opted for leniency over harsh punishment. This was a stark contrast to the paranoid and bloody reigns of the recent past. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that Rome had finally found the leader it had been dreaming of, a ruler guided by wisdom, justice, and a compassionate heart. So, here we have it. A young emperor, guided by wise advisors, enacting popular reforms, and showing a merciful hand. This was the Nero of the beginning, a figure of immense promise, celebrated by the people and respected by the Senate. It was a golden age, but as with all golden ages, the shadows were beginning to gather. The delicate balance of power between Agrippina, Seneca, and Burrus couldn't last forever, and the young emperor himself was growing, his own desires and ambitions starting to stir beneath the surface of the perfect Stoic prince. The question that hangs over these early years is this: was this promise genuine? Was this the real Nero? Or was it all just a beautifully constructed facade, destined to crumble and reveal the monster lurking within? The foundation of his future tyranny was being laid, even in these moments of triumph. Thank you for joining me for this look into Nero's early years. The story, as you can imagine, is about to take a dramatic turn. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter, where we'll explore the cracks that began to appear in this golden facade. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on the life of Nero. Last time, we saw a young emperor ascend to the throne, full of promise and guided by his ambitious mother, but the honeymoon period was destined to be short. Today, we delve into the growing cracks in their relationship, a power struggle that would set the stage for one of Rome's most infamous tragedies. This is the story of a mother and son at odds. When Nero became emperor at just 16, Agrippina saw it as the culmination of her life's work. She had schemed, married, and murdered her way to the top, all to place her son on the throne. Now, she expected to rule through him. In the early days, her influence was absolute. She appeared on coins alongside Nero, a first for a Roman empress. She attempted to sit beside him on a raised platform as he received an Armenian delegation, a public display of cruelty that was unheard of. It was only the quick thinking of Seneca, who advised Nero to descend and greet his mother, that prevented a major diplomatic incident. Agrippina wasn't just a background advisor. She wanted to be She held her own court, received her own reports, and tried to dictate policy. She saw herself as the true power behind the throne, and she wasn't shy about letting everyone know it. For her, Nero was a tool, a means to an end. The problem was, this tool was a young man with his own developing ideas, desires, and a growing sense of his own authority, and he was starting to get tired of being his mother's puppet. The first real signs of Nero's rebellion were personal, not political. He fell in love with a former slave named Claudia Octa. Agrippina was furious. This wasn't just about her son's choice of partner. It was a direct challenge to her control. She had grand plans for Nero's romantic life. Plans that involved strategic alliances and politically advantageous marriages. A relationship with a freed woman had no place in her vision. She berated Nero, insulted Act, and reminded him relentlessly of everything she had done for him. She tried to shame him into submission, but her tactics backfired spectacularly. Instead of bending to her will, Nero pushed back. The more Agrippina raged, the more he dug in his heels. He found allies in his tutors, Seneca and Burrus, who were also growing weary of Agrippina's constant interference. They saw an opportunity to reduce her power and increase their own influence over the young emperor. They gently encouraged Nero's independence, suggesting that as emperor, he had the right to make his own personal choices. They provided a buffer between mother and son, sympathizing with Nero's frustrations while trying to manage Agrippina's fury. This personal conflict soon spilled over into the political arena. Agrippina, feeling her grip on Nero slipping, made a fatal miscalculation. She started to threaten him. She reminded him that there was another, equally valid claimant to the throne. Britannicus, the son of the previous emperor, Claudius. She hinted that she could just as easily support Britannicus as she had supported Nero. To Nero, this wasn't just a threat. It was treason. The idea that his own mother would consider deposing him in favor of his stepbrother planted a seed of fear and paranoia that would grow with devastating consequences. The tension in the imperial palace must have been unbearable. Every conversation was loaded, every gesture scrutinized. Nero began to actively sideline his mother. He stripped her of her Praetorian Guard escort, a public symbol of her status and power. He then removed her from the palace on the Palatine Hill, exiling her to a private residence. This was a clear and public statement. Agrippina's reign as corollaire was over. She was no longer at the center of power, but was now on the periphery, an outsider looking in. This physical separation only deepened the emotional chasm between them. Agrippina, isolated and stripped of her authority, grew more bitter and resentful. Nero, finally tasting true freedom, became more confident and, arguably, more arrogant. He surrounded himself with friends who encouraged his artistic pursuits and his more extravagant tastes friends. His mother deeply disapproved of. He started to spend his nights roaming the streets of Rome in disguise, engaging in brawls and other less than imperial behavior. He was a young man reveling in his newfound independence, pushing every boundary his mother had ever set for him. This period marks a crucial turning point for Nero. He was no longer just a boy emperor controlled by others. He was actively shaping his own identity and his own rule. But in breaking free from his mother, he was also breaking free from one of the few people who, in her own twisted way, had his interests at heart. Seneca and Burrus were skilled politicians, but they weren't family. They guided him, but they also used him to advance their own agendas. The conflict between Nero and Agrippina was more than a family squabble. It was a battle for the soul of the Roman Empire. On one side was Agrippina, representing the old guard, tradition, and a ruthless but calculated approach to power. On the other was Nero, representing a new generation, a desire for personal freedom and a more populist, perhaps even reckless, style of leadership. As Nero asserted his independence, he wasn't just rejecting his mother, he was rejecting her entire political philosophy. The stage was now set for the final, tragic act of their relationship. By pushing her son away, Agrippina had inadvertently created a monster. She had taught him that power was everything and that loyalty was fleeting. She had shown him that betrayal, even of family, was a valid political tool. In his desperation to escape her control, Nero would soon use those very lessons against her. The more she threatened and plotted from the sidelines, the more Nero came to see her not as his mother, but as a dangerous rival who had to be eliminated. The love between mother and son had curdled into fear and hatred, a toxic mix that would soon explode into violence. Join us next time as we explore the dark and shocking conclusion to this maternal feud. The matricide of Agrippina is a story of paranoia, betrayal, and a son's ultimate act of rebellion that would forever stain his legacy. Thank you for watching. If you're finding the series fascinating, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in the dramatic life of Nero. See you next time. Welcome back to our series, where today we dive into one of history's most chilling chapters, the breakdown of the relationship between the Roman Emperor Nero and his formidable mother, Agrippina the Younger. This is a story of power, ambition, and the ultimate betrayal. In the early years of his reign, Nero was heavily influenced, some would say controlled, by Agrippina. She had clawed her way to the top, orchestrating his ascension to the throne, and she wasn't about to let go of the reins. Her face appeared alongside his own coins, a symbol of rulership unprecedented for a woman in Rome. But Nero was growing up. He was the emperor, and he was starting to resent her constant interference, her critiques of his personal life, and her iron grip on political affairs. The first cracks began to show. Nero started pushing back, removing her allies from positions of power and slowly, but surely, stripping away her authority. He dismissed her trusted guard and began to publicly ignore her advice. The court, ever sensitive to the shifting winds of power, took note. Agrippina, who once commanded the respect and fear of senators, found herself increasingly isolated. The bond between mother and son, once a pillar of the empire, was crumbling into dust. She was no longer the power behind the throne. She was becoming an obstacle. This growing estrangement wasn't just a family squabble. It was a political earthquake. Agrippina was furious. She had given him everything, and he was casting her aside. She began to drop not-so-subtle hints that there was another, more legitimate heir, Britannicus, the son of the former Emperor Claudius. This was a direct threat to Nero's rule. For Nero and his advisors, particularly the Stoic philosopher Seneca and the pragmatic Praetorian prefect, Agrippina's open hostility was a problem that could destabilize the entire empire. The tension was palpable. Everyone in Rome was watching, waiting to see who would make the first move in this deadly game of thrones. The situation escalated. Nero, feeling cornered and increasingly paranoid, saw his mother not as family, but as his chief rival. The air in the palace was thick with suspicion. Every whisper, every sideways glance, was interpreted as part of a plot. Agrippina, in her desperation, was becoming more reckless, while Nero was growing more ruthless. The stage was being set for a confrontation, but no one could have predicted just how dark and twisted it would become. The love that once existed between them had curdled into a toxic mix of fear and hatred. Then, something shifted. Seemingly out of nowhere, Nero extended an olive branch. He invited Agrippina to a festival at the beautiful coastal resort of Baiae, promising a grand reconciliation. He wrote her affectionate letters, spoke of his filial duty, and acted the part of a remorseful son desperate to mend their broken relationship. Agrippina, perhaps wanting to believe her son still loved her, or perhaps seeing it as an opportunity to regain her influence, accepted the invitation. The reunion was, by all accounts, a masterclass in deception. Nero hosted a lavish banquet in her honor. He was charming, attentive, and showered her with affection. They dined, they talked, they laughed late into the night. It seemed as though the rift was finally healed. As she prepared to leave, Nero embraced her warmly, a final, public display of their reconciliation. But this entire spectacle was a meticulously crafted lie, a prelude to a horrifying act. Nero wasn't planning to welcome his mother back. He was planning to eliminate her for good. As Agrippina set sail back to her villa across the bay, the true nature of Nero's plan was revealed. He had arranged for her to travel on a specially designed ship, engineered to collapse and sink in the calm night waters. It was meant to look like a tragic accident, a perfect, untraceably crime. As the vessel reached open water, the mechanism was triggered. The lead-weighted canopy above her couch crashed down. In the chaos, one of her attendants, thinking quickly, cried out that she was Agrippina, to draw the assassins to her. She was promptly clubbed to death. But the real Agrippina, a survivor to the very end, was only slightly injured on the shoulder. In an incredible display of resilience, Agrippina managed to slip overboard into the dark water. Despite her injury, she swam, eluding the assassin's oars until she was picked up by a small fishing boat and taken to her lakeside villa. The perfect crime had failed spectacularly. When news reached Nero that his mother had survived, he flew into a panic. There was no more room for subtlety. An accident could be explained, but a failed assassination attempt was an open declaration of war. Nero was terrified. He summoned his advisors, Seneca and Burrus, who understood the gravity of the situation. Agrippina was alive, and she knew her own son had tried to kill her. She would not remain silent. There was only one way to resolve this now. There could be no more staged accidents or elaborate plots. A direct and brutal approach was needed. The mask was off. Nero dispatched a group of assassins to his mother's villa, led by his freedman Anicetus, the very man who had designed the collapsible boat. They found Agrippina resting in her bedroom. When she saw the armed men surround her bed, she knew her time had come. In a final, defiant act, according to the historian Tacitus, she pointed to her womb and declared, "Strike here," as if to say this was the body that had given birth to her own murderer. The assassins showed no mercy. They struck her down, ending the life of one of Rome's most ambitious and influential women. The murder of one's own mother, matricide, was one of the most heinous crimes imaginable in Roman society. Nero, the emperor, was now a matricide. The act would haunt him for the rest of his life, becoming the defining crime of his reign and cementing his legacy as a tyrant. The shadows of this betrayal would stretch far, coloring every decision he made from that point on, and ultimately leading to his own tragic downfall. Thank you so much for joining us for this dark chapter in Roman history. It's a powerful reminder of how ambition can corrupt even the closest of bonds. If you found this story fascinating, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode. We'll see you then. Las 0 y 15. Hello, history lovers, and welcome back to our deep dive into the life of Emperor Nero. In our last chapter, we saw a young emperor consolidating his power. Today, in chapter 8, we'll be pulling back the curtain on the side of Nero that truly set him apart from every Roman emperor before him. His all-consuming passion for the arts. 015 to 045. Imagine this. You're a Roman senator. You've spent your life in the rigid, hyper-masculine world of Roman politics and military campaigns. Now, the most powerful man in the world, your emperor, isn't interested in just conquering new lands or building aqueducts. No. His heart beats for the strum of a lyre, the drama of the stage, and the thunder of hooves on the racetrack. For Nero, these weren't just hobbies. They were his life's breath. 045 to 115 from a young age. Nero was drawn to music and poetry. He dedicated hours each day to practicing the cithara, a type of lyre, and to vocal exercises. He believed he was a genuinely gifted artist, a virtuoso destined for the stage. But in ancient Rome, this was a problem. Uge 1. Acting, singing, and even chariot racing for public entertainment were considered professions for the lower classes. For slaves, or for foreigners, it was seen as undignified, effeminate, and utterly beneath the station of a Roman aristocrat, let alone the emperor. 115 to 145, but Nero didn't care. He craved the roar of the crowd, not just for his edicts, but for his performances. He began by holding private concerts for his inner circle at the palace. You can picture the scene. Senators and noblemen, forced to sit for hours, listening to their emperor sing. They had to applaud. Of course, but you can bet they were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This was not how an emperor was supposed to behave. 145 to 215 soon. Private performances weren't enough. Nero yearned for a real audience. He established the Neronia, a festival of music, gymnastics, and horsemanship modeled on the Greek Olympic Games. And who was the star competitor in the artistic events? You guessed it. Emperor Nero himself. He would step onto the stage, lyre in hand, and perform his own compositions for the mass. 215 to 245, according to the historian Suetonius. Nero took these performances incredibly seriously. He would follow all the rules of the competition malacia to the letter. He wouldn't sit down when tired, or wipe the sweat from his brow with anything other than his robe. He would wait anxiously for the judge's verdict, just like any other competitor. To him, this wasn't a game. It was the validation of his very soul as an artist. 245 to 315, the Roman elite were horrified. For them, it was a scandal of epic proportions. The emperor, the descendant of the divine Augustus, was debasing himself, performing on stage like a common actor. Actors, in Roman society, were in fame's literally infamous. They had limited legal rights and were seen as morally corrupt. For the emperor to voluntarily join their ranks was a shock to the entire social order. 315 to 345, imagine the whispers echoing through the marbled halls of the Senate. Have you heard? The emperor sang in public. They say he played a tragic heroine on stage. This is decadence. The ancestors would be turning in their graves. Every performance chipped away at his authority and gravitas in their eyes. They saw it as proof that he was unfit to rule, more interested in applause than in administration. 345 to 415, and it wasn't just music. Nero was equally obsessed with the theater. He not only wrote plays, but also acted in them, often taking on the lead roles in Greek tragedies. He would don the masks and costumes of heroes and even goddesses. This was even more shocking to the conservative Roman mindset. The idea of their emperor, the embodiment of Roman power and manliness, dressing up and pretending to be someone else on a public stage was beyond comprehension. 415 to 445, the historian Tacitus, one of our main sources, writes with disdain about these spectacles. He describes the nobility being forced to attend, and the Praetorian Guard Spacos being stationed in the theater, not just to protect the emperor, but to make sure no one in the audience left or showed disrespect. There are even accounts of people faking their own deaths, just to be carried out of the theater and escape one of Nero's marathon performances. 445 to 515, then there was the third of his great passions. Chariot racing. This was slightly more acceptable for an aristocrat. But Nero took it to another level. He didn't just own a team. He wanted to be the star charioteer. He built a private racetrack in the Vatican Valley, where he would practice for hours. Eventually, he began competing in public, driving his own chariot in the Circus Maximus, the grandest racetrack in all of Rome. 515 to 545, the Roman people, the common plebs, had a different view. While the senators sneered, many in the crowds loved it. They were Rusatu bred in circuses, and here was an emperor who not only provided the entertainment, but starred in it. He was one of them, sharing in their favorite pastimes. This populist appeal was a card Nero played, but it only widened the chasm between him and the ruling class. 545 to 615, so we see this incredible divide. On one side, you have Nero the artist, convinced of his own genius, desperately seeking the love and admiration of his people through his performances. On the other, you have the Roman Senate, watching in disgust as their emperor tramples over centuries of tradition and decorum. They didn't see an artist. They saw a tyrant lost in his own vanity, a showman unfit for the throne. 615 to 645, this obsession with a non-Roman identity. This elevation of Greek artistic culture over Roman military and political values became a central point of conflict in his reign. It wasn't just a quirky personality trait. It was a political statement. Nero was signaling a new kind of rule, one based on culture and spectacle rather than old-fashioned conquest and stoic duty. 645 to 715 for the senators. This was a clear sign of his unsuitability and moral decay. They saw his passions not as harmless hobbies, but as a dangerous neglect of his duties and a flagrant disrespect for Roman identity. The whispers of decadence grew louder, and the resentment festered. They believed an emperor should be commanding legions, not competing for a laurel wreath in a poetry contest. 715 to 745. This fundamental clash of values would have devastating consequences. Nero's belief in his artistic destiny blinded him to the political danger he was in. He saw the senators' disapproval not as a valid political concern, but as the jealousy of uncultured brutes who couldn't appreciate his talent. This mutual misunderstanding created a toxic atmosphere of suspicion and contempt at the very heart of the Roman Empire. 745 to 815, the stage was set, quite literally, for a tragedy. Nero's passions, the very things that he believed defined him and made him special, were also the things that isolated him from the power structure he was supposed to command. The emperor was an actor, and the senators were his most hostile critics. This wasn't just about entertainment. It was a battle for the soul of Rome itself. 815 to 845, and that battle was about to take a much darker turn. Nero's desire for a grander stage and his growing frustration with the old, cramped city of Rome would soon coincide with one of the most infamous events in all of ancient history. His artistic ambitions were about to be fused with an opportunity for urban renewal on an unimaginable scale. 845 to 915, in our next chapter, we will witness the sparks that lit the great fire of Rome. Was Nero the fiddle-playing garçoniste of legend, clearing land for his golden palace, or was he a victim of circumstance, his reputation later burned by hostile historians? The flames are rising, and the city is about to be turned to ash. 9:15 to 10 o'clock, thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Nero's controversial passions. If you're enjoying this series and want to see what happens when the fire starts, please make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. Your support means the world to me. As always, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Was Nero a misunderstood artist or a delusional tyrant? Let's discuss. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our series on the life of Nero. In our last chapter, we saw a young emperor finding his footing, but today we delve into a much darker period. This is Chapter 9, Blood in the Family, where the glamour of the imperial court hides a chilling reality. Imagine being Octavia, the daughter of an emperor, married to another, yet finding yourself completely alone. Her marriage to Nero was a political arrangement, cold and loveless from the start. She was a symbol of the old guard, a constant reminder of Claudius, the Emperor Nero succeeded. While Rome respected her for her lineage and modest demeanor, within the palace, she was an outcast. Nero, captivated by his ambitious mistress, Poppaea, Sabina, had no time or affection for his wife. Octavia's life was one of quiet dignity amidst constant humiliation, a lonely existence in the gilded cage of the imperial palace. The public adored Octavia. To them, she was the virtuous empress, a stark contrast to the scandalous affairs of the court. Her popularity was her only shield, but it was a fragile one. As Nero's infatuation with Poppaea grew, Octavia became an obstacle. Poppaea, known for her beauty, wit, and relentless ambition, wanted more than to be the emperor's mistress. She wanted to be empress, and for that to happen, Octavia had to be removed. The first move against Octavia was divorce. The pretext was flimsy. Nero accused her of being unable to bear children. This action sparked public outrage. The people of Rome took to the streets, not in a violent rebellion, but in a powerful display of support for their beloved empress. They carried her statues through the city, cheering for her and tearing down the images of Poppaea. For a moment, it seemed public opinion might save her. Nero, perhaps startled by the strength of the reaction, even briefly appeared to reconcile with Octavia. But this was just a temporary reprieve, a calm before the storm. The pressure from Poppaea was relentless. She reportedly taunted Nero, questioning his power if he could be swayed by a street mob. The conspiracy against Octavia was renewed, this time with a more sinister and permanent goal. False charges were fabricated. First, they accused her of an illicit affair, a serious crime for an empress. But the key witness, a former slave of Octavius named T, couldn't produce credible evidence, even under torture. When that failed, they concocted an even more serious charge. Treason. Anicetus, the admiral who had helped orchestrate the demise of Nero's mother, was brought in to confess to a fabricated plot with Octavia to overthrow the emperor. It was a complete sham, but it was enough. With this false confession, Octavia's fate was sealed. She was declared an enemy of the state and banished to the remote island of Pandateria. This small, desolate island was a place of exile, a prison from which few returned. But exile wasn't enough. The order for her death soon followed. According to the historian Tacitus, when the soldiers arrived, Octavia, just 20 years old, pleaded for her life. She was a widow, a sister, not a wife anymore, but her pleas were ignored. The scene described as haunting. Her veins were cut, but in her terror, the blood flowed too slowly. She was then taken to a vapor bath and suffocated by the steam. The end of Octavia's life is a truly tragic moment in Roman history. Her head was severed and sent back to Rome, a gruesome trophy for Poppaea to gaze upon. With Octavia gone, the path was clear. Nero married Poppaea, Sabino just 12 days after divorcing Octavia. Poppaea had finally achieved her goal. She was the Empress of Rome. But her reign and her life would also be marked by the darkness that seemed to permeate Nero's inner circle. The marriage to Poppaea ushered in a new era of extravagance and influence at court. She was a powerful figure, known for her lavish lifestyle. It was said she bathed in donkey's milk to preserve her skin's beauty, requiring a herd of hundreds of donkeys to travel with her. But behind this facade day of glamour, rumors of cruelty and violence swirled. The palace, which had already witnessed the murder of Britannicus and Agrippina, was now a place where fear and suspicion were constant companions. Whispers of Nero's escalating paranoia and his violent temper became more frequent. The death of Octavia had shown that no one was safe, not even those closest to the emperor. The story of Poppaea's own end is shrouded in mystery and contradiction. The most famous account, again from Tacitus, claims that in a fit of rage, Nero kicked a pregnant Poppaea, leading to her death. Other sources suggest she died from complications in childbirth or illness. We may never know the exact truth, but the fact that the most enduring story is one of domestic violence speaks volumes about the reputation Nero had cultivated. Whether true or not, the tale of the emperor killing his own wife and unborn child cemented his image as a monster in the eyes of many, both then and now. This period of Nero's reign reveals a man increasingly isolated by his own power and paranoia. He had eliminated his stepbrother, his mother, and his first wife. He was surrounded by sycophants and those who feared him, with few left to offer genuine counsel or restraint. The blood in the family wasn't just a series of isolated tragedies. It was the dismantling of his own support system, the severing of ties that connected him to his past and to any sense of normal human morality. This descent into tyranny set the stage for the even more dramatic and destructive events that were to come, including the Great Fire of Rome and the persecution of the Christians, which we will explore in our next chapter. The deaths of Octavia and Poppaea are more than just palace gossip. They are critical turning points. They demonstrate the terrifying reality of absolute power and the personal corruption that can accompany it. Nero's journey from a promising young ruler to a feared tyrant was paved with the blood of his own family. Thank you for joining us for this dark chapter in Nero's story. It's a difficult part of his life to examine, but crucial to understanding the man he became. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss Chapter 10. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the annals of history. Today, we'll be diving into one of the most infamous events of the Roman Empire, the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. This wasn't just a fire, it was a cataclysm that reshaped a city and forever tarnished the legacy of an emperor. So, grab your virtual togas, and let's step back in time. The year is 64 CE. Rome is the sprawling, chaotic, and magnificent heart of a vast empire. Under the rule of Emperor Nero, it's a city of marble and brick, but also of tightly packed wooden tenements, narrow winding streets, and a population bursting at the seams. It's a tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. And on the night of July 18th, that spark ignited. The fire started in the merchant area surrounding the Circus Maximus, Rome's massive chariot racing stadium. Fanned by a strong summer wind, the flames quickly leaped from shop to shop, from one wooden apartment building to the next. The initial response was slow and disorganized. Rome had a fire brigade, the asterisk vigils asterisk. But the scale of this blaze was unlike anything they had ever faced. The narrow streets became death traps, hindering escape and rescue efforts, while the fire consumed everything in its path. Imagine the scene. The night sky glowing in apocalyptic orange. The roar of the inferno drowning out the screams of the terrified populace. People scrambled to save their families and whatever meager possessions they could carry. But the fire moved with terrifying speed. For 6 days and 7 nights, the blaze raged uncontrollably. It would die down in one area only to flare up again in another, seemingly with a will of its own. By the time the flames were finally extinguished, the devastation was almost total. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 remained untouched. 3 were completely leveled, and the other 7 were left as charred, smoking ruins. Priceless works of art, magnificent temples, public buildings, and thousands of homes were turned to ash. The city that had stood for centuries was brought to its knees in less than a week. The human cost was immense, with countless lives lost and hundreds of thousands left homeless, wandering the ashes of their former lives. Panic and despair gripped the survivors. Where would they live? What would they eat? And most importantly, who was to blame? This is where a story takes its most famous and controversial turn. As Rome smoldered, whispers and rumors began to spread like wildfire themselves. The most enduring of these is the image of Emperor Nero callously playing his lyre, or fiddling, while his city burned. This story of a decadent ruler reveling in his people's suffering has been etched into popular culture for 2 millennia. But is it true? Let's look at the facts as historians know them. According to the most reliable contemporary source, the historian Tacitus, Nero was actually away from Rome when the fire broke out. He was at his villa in Antium, about 35 miles away. Upon hearing the news, he rushed back to the city and immediately took charge of the relief efforts. Tacitus tells us that Nero opened his own palaces and private gardens to shelter the homeless. He arranged for food supplies to be brought in from surrounding cities and sold at a reduced price to feed the desperate populace. These are not the actions of a man indifferent to his city's fate. So where did the fiddling while Rome burned story come from? It likely originated from Nero's political enemies and the general public's growing dislike for him. Nero was known for his artistic ambitions. He fancied himself a great poet, singer, and musician. He had a reputation for theatricality and There were reports that during the fire, he went to a private stage and sang about the destruction of Troy, comparing Rome's fate to the legendary fallen city. To a population that had just lost everything, this would have seemed monstrously insensitive, even if it wasn't done in public. Whether he actually did this is debated, but the story was powerful propaganda. It painted him as a detached, cruel tyrant, more concerned with his art than his people. The rumors got even darker. Some whispered that Nero himself had started the fire. Why? The motive, they claimed, was to clear land. Nero had long dreamed of a grand building project, a magnificent palace complex he would call the asterisk Domus Aurea Asterisk, or Golden House. The fire conveniently destroyed a large part of the city where he wanted to build it. It seemed too perfect to be a coincidence. After the fire, Nero did indeed seize a huge tract of land around 100 to 300 acres to begin construction on his opulent new residence. This act cemented the suspicion in many Romans' minds. Nero had sacrificed their homes for his own vanity. Faced with a furious and suspicious populace, Nero needed a scapegoat, and he found one in a small, misunderstood religious sect, the Christians. At this time, Christians were a fringe group in Rome, viewed with suspicion. Their beliefs and customs were strange to the Romans, and they were an easy target. Nero launched a brutal persecution. According to Tacitus, Christians were arrested and subjected to horrific tortures. They were crucified, thrown to wild animals in the arena, or, in a particularly cruel twist of irony, coated in flammable material and set alight to serve as human torches in Nero's gardens. It was a brutal and cynical move to deflect blame and channel public anger away from himself. The Great Fire of Rome was a pivotal moment, It not only devastated the physical city but also fractured the relationship between the emperor and his people. Nero's response, from the ambitious construction of the Domus Aurea to the horrific persecution of the Christians, solidified his reputation for tyranny and cruelty. While he may not have fiddled in the literal sense, his actions after the fire ensured that his name would forever be associated with this catastrophic event. The rebuilding of Rome was a monumental task. The new city that rose from the ashes was different, built with wider streets, more fire-resistant materials like brick and stone, and better access to water. In a way, the fire allowed for a much-needed urban renewal. But the scars of 64 CE ran deep, not just on the landscape, but in the Roman psyche. It was a tragedy that exposed the vulnerabilities of the world's greatest city and the dark potential of its leader. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Great Fire of Rome. It's a story filled with drama, tragedy, and political intrigue that continues to fascinate us to this day. What do you think? Was Nero a misunderstood leader doing his best? Or a calculating tyrant who burned his own city? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And do you forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you do miss our next chapter in history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series on the Roman Empire. When we last left off, Rome was a smoldering ruin. The Great Fire of 64 AD had torn through the heart of the city, leaving behind a landscape of ash and devastation. For many, it was the end of the world. But for Emperor Nero, it was a blank canvas. From the embers of the old city, he envisioned a new Rome, a city not just rebuilt, but reborn in his own image. Grander, more glorious, and more controversial than anything the world had ever seen. This is the story of how Nero, in the face of disaster, began to construct his ultimate monument, a project that would define his reign and forever divide public opinion. A new Rome was about to rise. Nero wasn't one to waste a crisis. While much of Rome was still reeling, grappling with homelessness and loss, the emperor was already drawing up blueprints. His plan was ambitious, to say the least. This wasn't just about repairing the damage. It was a complete urban overhaul. He proposed wider streets to act as fire breaks, new building codes requiring the use of fire-resistant stone like Albon and Gabine tuff, and a more organized, grid-like layout for the rebuilt areas. On the surface, these were sensible, forward-thinking reforms that would make Rome safer and more livable. But beneath this veneer of public service lay a much grander, more personal ambition. Nero didn't just want to rebuild Rome for the Romans. He wanted to rebuild it for himself. He had cleared the land, both by fire and by decree, for his masterpiece. At the heart of Nero's new Rome was a project of such breathtaking scale and opulence that it would become legendary. The Domus Aurea, or the Golden House. This wasn't just a palace. It was a miniature city, a sprawling estate that consumed a vast portion of central Rome, covering parts of the Palatine, Esquiline, and Celian hills. We're talking about an area estimated to be somewhere between 100 and 300 acres. To put that in perspective, that's larger than Vatican City today. It was a statement of absolute power, a declaration that the emperor's residence was not just a part of the city, but the very center of its universe. The Golden House was designed to blur the lines between public and private space, city and countryside, reality and myth. The architects behind this colossal undertaking were Severus and Celer, two men described by the historian Tacitus as ingenious and daring, willing to use art to challenge nature itself, and challenge it. They did. The Golden House was a wonderland of architectural innovation. It featured revolving dining rooms, where the ceilings, inlaid with ivory panels, would shower guests with flowers and perfume. It had bathhouses supplied with both seawater and sulfur water, piped in from miles away. The walls weren't just painted. They were adorned with shimmering frescoes, encrusted with gold leaf and precious gems, and decorated with mother-of-pearl. This was a level of luxury that made even the most extravagant villas of the Roman elite look like humble farmhouses. Perhaps the most famous feature of the Domus Aurea was its artificial lake, right in the heart of the city, where the Colosseum would later stand. Nero's architects excavated a massive basin and filled it with water, creating a personal lake surrounded by a pastoral landscape. The grounds were designed to look like a countryside estate, complete with pastures for herds of animals, vineyards, and groves of trees. It was as if Nero had taken a piece of rural paradise and dropped it into the middle of the world, its most crowded metropolis. For the emperor, it was a private escape. For the people of Rome, who could see this private world being built over the ashes of their former homes, it was a constant, glittering reminder of the gap between their reality and his fantasy. And overlooking it all was the Colossus of Nero. This was a gigantic, 120-foot-old bronze statue of the emperor, depicted in the guise of the sun god, Sol. Originally placed in the vestibule of the Golden House, its sheer size was meant to awe and intimidate. Imagine walking through the streets of Rome and seeing this towering, gleaming figure of your emperor as a god, watching over his private domain. It was a powerful piece of propaganda, reinforcing the idea of Nero's divine status and his absolute control over the city and its people. The message was clear. This is Nero's Rome. But as the Golden House rose, so did the resentment. While the common people of Rome struggled to rebuild their lives, they saw vast resources and manpower being poured into the emperor's personal pleasure palace. The cost was astronomical, funded by draining the provincial treasuries and devaluing the currency. Rumors began to fly. People whispered that Nero had started the fire himself just to clear the land for his project. While historians still debate the truth of that accusation, it's what many Romans believed at the time. They saw their city burning and their emperor building his dream house on the ruins. The grandeur of the Domus Aurea wasn't seen as a symbol of Rome's recovery. It was seen as a symbol of Nero's selfishness. The extravagance was simply beyond comprehension for many. The historian Suetonius tells us that when the palace was finally finished, Nero's only comment was, "Good. Now I can at last begin to live like a human being." This quote, whether real or embellished, perfectly captures the disconnect between the emperor and his subjects. For him, this unparalleled luxury was the bare minimum for a person of his stature. For the senators and the common folk alike, it was an insult. It flew in the face of traditional Roman values of modesty and public service. An emperor was supposed to be the first citizen, not a divine king living in a gilded cage while his people suffered. The Golden House became the ultimate symbol of Nero's tyranny and decadence. The political fallout was immense. The construction of the Domus Aurea, combined with the financial strain it placed on the empire and the lingering suspicion about the fire, created a perfect storm of discontent. The senatorial class, already wary of Nero's populist leanings and autocratic style, saw the Golden House as the final straw. It represented a fundamental break with Roman tradition, a move towards the kind of Eastern Hellenistic monarchy that Romans had always viewed with suspicion. This resentment would fester and grow, fueling conspiracies and ultimately leading to the Pisonian conspiracy in 65 AD, a major plot to assassinate Nero. Although the plot failed, it was a clear sign that the foundations of Nero's power were cracking, and the Golden House was a major reason why. In the end, Nero's dream was short-lived. He would enjoy his Golden House for only a few years before his downfall and suicide in 68 AD. The emperors who followed him, the Flavians, made a very deliberate effort to dismantle Nero's legacy. They gave the land back to the people. The artificial lake was drained and became the site for the Flavian amphitheater. What we now call the Colosseum, a place of public entertainment, built directly on top of Nero's private lake. Parts of the Domus Aurea were stripped of their marble and jewels, filled in with earth, and used as foundations for new public buildings, like the Baths of Trajan. The new rulers understood that to win back the hearts of the people, they had to erase the most potent symbol of Nero's tyranny. The Golden House, once a testament to one man's ego, was buried and built over, its memory suppressed. But its legend, a cautionary tale of ambition and excess, would endure for centuries. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter. The story of Nero is a powerful reminder of how quickly glory can turn to infamy. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue exploring the fascinating history of Rome, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where we'll delve into the final, tumultuous years of Nero's reign. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series, where we're journeying through the early chapters of Christian history. Today, we delve into a dark, yet pivotal period, the first major state-sponsored persecution under Emperor Nero. This is Chapter 12. The persecution of the Christians. Our story begins in the year 64 AD. A catastrophic fire, known as the Great Fire of Rome, rages for 6 days, consuming vast swaths of the city. 10 of Rome's 14 districts are left in smoldering ruins. The population is devastated, homeless, and angry. Whispers and accusations begin to circulate, pointing a finger at the most powerful man in the empire, Emperor Nero himself. The Roman historian Tacitus tells us that to deflect these damaging rumors, Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one in a small, misunderstood religious group that was quietly growing within the city. The Christians. At this time, Christians were seen as a strange and secretive sect. They were outsiders, separating themselves from Roman pagan traditions, which made them easy targets for suspicion and slander. Nero seized this opportunity. He publicly blamed the Christians for the fire, launching a wave of brutal persecution. This wasn't just a legal matter. It was a public spectacle of cruelty designed to appease the Roman mob and divert their anger. The punishments inflicted upon the accused were horrific. According to historical accounts, Christians were arrested en masse, not necessarily on evidence of arson, but on the grounds of what was called hatred of the human race. The methods of execution were designed for maximum shock and entertainment. Tacitus describes scenes that are hard to comprehend. Some Christians were covered in the skins of wild animals and then torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were crucified in a particularly gruesome display. Many were tied to posts in Nero's gardens, covered in flammable materials, and set ablaze to serve as human torches, illuminating the emperor's nighttime festivities. Imagine the terror and the chaos. This was a community that preached love, peace, and forgiveness, now facing the full, unrestrained wrath of the Roman state. It's important to understand the context. For the average Roman citizen, this was a display of imperial power and justice. For the Christians, it was a terrifying test of faith. They were a small, nascent community, suddenly thrust into the horrifying spotlight of imperial persecution. This brutal campaign marked a significant turning point. It was the first time the Roman Empire officially targeted Christians simply for being Christians. Before this, any hostility was usually localized and sporadic. Nero's persecution established a dangerous precedent, making Christianity an illicit religion and its followers criminals in the eyes of the state. But this period of intense suffering also gave rise to something powerful, the concept of martyrdom. The word martyr comes from the Greek word for witness. For the early Christians, dying for their faith was the ultimate act of witnessing to the truth of their beliefs. The courage and unwavering faith of those who faced these terrible deaths did not go unnoticed. Their stories began to circulate among the scattered Christian communities. These weren't tales of defeat, but of spiritual victory. The martyrs were seen as heroes who had followed in Jesus' footsteps, remaining faithful even unto death. Their example became a source of incredible inspiration and strength for those who remained. This is a crucial paradox of persecution. Nero's intention was to eradicate this new faith, to stamp it out with fear and violence. However, the effect was often the opposite. The Tertullian, a later Christian author, famously wrote, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." The resilience and conviction of the persecuted Christians drew admiration and curiosity from some onlookers. Their willingness to die for their beliefs made others question what could possibly inspire such devotion. The stories of the Neronian martyrs, though born from unimaginable suffering, became foundational to Christian identity. They were a testament to a faith that could not be extinguished by fire or sword. These were the first of countless individuals throughout history who would face persecution for their beliefs, and their legacy solidified the importance of perseverance and conviction within the Christian faith. So, while Nero may have been searching for a scapegoat to save his own reputation, his actions inadvertently forged the identity of the early church in the crucible of suffering. He intended to destroy it, but instead, he helped sow the seeds of its eventual growth, transforming its members from a quiet sect into a community defined by its courage and its martyrs. The persecution under Nero was a horrifying chapter, but it was also the beginning of a story of incredible resilience that would shape the course of Western civilization. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into a critical moment in history. It's a somber topic, but essential for understanding the journey of the early church. If you found this chapter enlightening, please give this video a like, and consider subscribing to our channel for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Have you ever imagined an emperor trading his throne for a stage? A ruler who cared more about applause than politics? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today with one of Rome's most infamous figures, Nero. This wasn't just a quirky hobby. It was his life's passion, a burning desire to be remembered not as a Caesar, but as a star. So, grab your popcorn, because we're about to pull back the curtain on the most theatrical emperor in history. Let's set the scene. It's 66 AD. While most Roman emperors were busy conquering lands or managing the vast empire, Nero was on tour. Yes, a full-blown tour of Greece, the ancient heartland of arts and culture. For Nero, this was the ultimate pilgrimage. He wasn't there as a conquering general. He was there as a competitor. He entered the most prestigious artistic and athletic competitions in the ancient world, including the legendary Olympic Pythian and Isthmian Games. Now, when we think of the Olympics, we picture wrestling, running, and discus throwing. Nero did participate in some of those, most famously in a 10-horse chariot race, where he fell and still managed to be declared the winner, but that's a story for another time. His real focus was on the artistic contests, lyre playing, singing, and acting. He saw himself as a virtuoso, an heir to Apollo himself. He trained rigorously, practicing his scales, memorizing epic poems, and perfecting his stage presence. This wasn't just a case of an emperor wanting to win. It was an artist desperate for validation on the world's biggest stage. Imagine the scene. The Emperor of Rome, draped in theatrical costume, standing before a packed Greek amphitheater. The crowd, a mix of genuine fans, curious onlookers, and people who knew better than to boo the most powerful man in the world, held their breath. Nero would take his lyre, clear his throat, and pour his heart out into song. He performed long, dramatic pieces, often playing roles from Greek tragedies, like Oedipus or Hercules. He wept, he roared, he sang with all the passion he could muster. And the results? He won a lot. In fact, historical sources say he collected over 1,800 victory crowns during his Greek tour. Now, was this purely on merit? It's highly unlikely. The judges were surely, let's say, encouraged, to find his performances exceptional. After all, who would dare tell the Emperor of Rome that he was a bit off-key? But in Nero's mind, every crown was a confirmation of his genius. He had them all carefully shipped back to Rome to be displayed in a grand procession, a testament to his artistic triumphs. For him, these leafy wreaths were more valuable than any military standard captured in battle. This Greek tour was the culmination of a lifelong obsession. Back in Rome, Nero had already been shaking up the conservative Roman elite for years with his public performances. To a traditional Roman senator, the idea of an emperor on stage was scandalous. Actors and musicians were considered low-status professionals, not a suitable occupation for the head of state. It was seen as undignified, frivolous, and fundamentally unrighteous. The proper place for an emperor was in the Senate, on the battlefield, or presiding over state religious ceremonies, not reciting poetry in a costume. But Nero didn't care about tradition. He craved the spotlight. He established his own set of games in Rome, the Neronia, modeled after the Greek festivals. These games, held every 5 years, included musical, equestrian, and gymnastic contests. And guess who the star performer was? You got it. Nero himself would often open the proceedings with a song or a poem. He didn't just perform. He demanded an audience. He would often force the Roman elite senators, equestrians, and their families to attend his recitals, which could last for hours. Imagine being a powerful, stern-faced senator, accustomed to debating matters of war and state, now being required to sit through a multi-hour lyre concert performed by the emperor. Leaving early was not an option. The historian Tacitus tells us that the doors were locked, and guards were posted to prevent anyone from escaping. People were so desperate that some pretended to faint just to be carried out, while others even tried to scale the walls. It was a captive audience, in the most literal sense. Why this compulsion? Why force the very people who disdained his art to watch it? Part of it was ego. Nero desperately wanted the approval of the Roman aristocracy, the very class that looked down on him. He believed that if they just saw his talent, they would understand his greatness. He wanted to convert them, to make them see that art was just as noble as politics or war. But his methods were more coercive than persuasive. Instead of winning their hearts, he bred resentment. His performances became a symbol of his tyranny, a blatant disregard for Roman values and decorum. This obsession reveals the core of Nero's identity. He didn't see himself as a statesman who happened to enjoy art. He saw himself as an artist who was unfortunately burdened with the job of being emperor. While his predecessors like Augustus and Claudius had focused on building infrastructure, reforming laws, and securing the borders, Nero's legacy projects were different. He built a colossal personal palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. It was less of an imperial residence and more of a sprawling monument to pleasure and art. It had artificial lakes, revolving dining rooms, and walls adorned with exquisite frescoes in gold leaf. It was a playground for an artist king. This grand vision was completely at odds with the practicalities of governing. While provincial governors were dealing with rebellions and the treasury was facing deficits, Nero was rehearsing. He would spend his days with musicians, actors, and poets, discussing the finer points of meter and melody. He saw ruling as a distraction from his true calling. He once famously said, "What an artist dies in me." As he faced his final moments, this wasn't the lament of a failed emperor. It was the cry of an artist who felt his life's work was being cut short. Ultimately, Nero's dream was to be remembered not as a conqueror or a lawgiver, but as a cultural icon. He wanted his name to be uttered in the same breath as Homer or Sophocles. He envisioned a future where people would study his poems and sing his songs, where his theatrical performances would be legendary. He wanted to be the immortal artist, not the mortal emperor. The irony, of course, is that he failed spectacularly in achieving this dream, at least in the way he intended. His artistic pursuits, which he hoped would immortalize him as a genius, became a key part of his infamous reputation. For his contemporaries, and for later historians, his obsession with the stage was proof of his unsuitability to rule. It was seen as self-indulgent, decadent, and a dereliction of duty. His forced concerts and rigged competitions weren't viewed as artistic triumphs, but as acts of a tyrant. In the end, Nero's story is a fascinating and tragic clash of worlds. It is the story of a man who held the most powerful position in the world, but yearned for a different kind of glory. He was the artist on the throne, a figure who fundamentally misunderstood what his role required. While he reached for the laurel wreaths of a poet, his empire began to crumble around him. His desire to be a cultural icon ended up cementing his legacy as one of history's most notorious tyrants. The applause he so desperately craved in life turned into 2 millennia of condemnation after his death. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Nero's theatrical world. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the stage we want isn't the one we're meant to be on. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from history. We'd love to have you in our community. See you next time. Hello, history buffs, and welcome back to our journey through the annals of the Roman Empire. In our last episode, we explored the peak of imperial grandeur, a time when Rome seemed invincible. But as we all know, even the mightiest empires have their breaking points. Today, we're diving into Chapter 14, Revolts and Unrest. This is where the polished marble facade of the empire begins to show its cracks. So, picture this. The Roman eagle soars high, its shadow stretching across 3 continents. From the outside, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, appears unbreakable. But beneath the surface, a storm is brewing. The very people entrusted to maintain this peace, the generals and governors stationed in provinces, are starting to feel the seeds of dissatisfaction taking root. Why? Well, it's a complicated cocktail of ambition, frustration, and a sense of neglect. Imagine you're a powerful general. You spent years on the frontier, fighting off barbarian hordes, securing borders, and winning glorious victories in the name of Rome. You command legions of loyal soldiers who look up to you, not some distant emperor they've never met. You see the administrative mess, the heavy taxes burdening your province, and the decadent politics of the capital. You start to think, I'm the one holding this frontier together. I'm the one with the real power. Why should I listen to a ruler thousands of miles away who seems more interested in palace intrigue than the welfare of the empire? This wasn't just idle thought. It was a dangerous reality that was starting to bubble up across Rome's vast territories. The central authority in Rome, en se absolute, was beginning to feel more like a suggestion than a command. This growing discontent wasn't just a quiet murmur. It soon erupted into open rebellion. Let's travel first to Gaul, a region known for its fierce warriors and independent spirit. Despite being Romanized for generations, the old Celtic pride was never fully extinguished. Local leaders, often Roman-trained generals of Gallic descent, saw an opportunity. They tapped into local grievances, crushing taxes, cultural imposition, and the sheer distance from the heart of the empire. Uprisings flared, not just as chaotic riots, but as organized attempts to create a separate Gallic empire. These rebels weren't barbarians at the gates. They were insiders, men who understood the Roman military machine and knew how to use it against its creators. The legions sent to crush them were often met by forces that were their mirror image, leading to brutal and costly civil wars that drained the empire's resources and manpower. Now, let's shift our gaze southwest to Hispania, or modern-day Spain. Like Gaul, Hispania was a vital part of the empire, rich in minerals and agricultural wealth. But here too, the story was similar. Governors, vested with immense power, began to operate with increasing autonomy. They saw the political instability back in Rome rising and falling in quick succession, and decided to hedge their bets. One notable governor, Galba, famously used his position in Hispania as a launchpad to make a bid for the imperial throne itself. His rebellion sent shockwaves through the system. It demonstrated that a provincial governor with a few loyal legions could realistically challenge the emperor. This set a perilous precedent. From that point on, every ambitious governor became a potential usurper, and every legion a potential kingmaker. The empire was turning on itself. And then we moved to the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, to the volatile province of Judea. The situation here was different, yet just as explosive. The unrest in Judea wasn't primarily driven by the ambition of Roman governors, but by a deep-seated clash of cultures and religious beliefs. The Jewish people, with their staunch monotheism and ancient traditions, fiercely resisted Roman attempts to impose their polytheistic religion and imperial cult. Tensions had been simmering for decades, fueled by corrupt Roman officials, heavy taxation, and religious insensitivity. These tensions finally boiled over into a full-scale revolt known as the First Jewish-Roman War. This wasn't just a military conflict. It was a desperate struggle for cultural and religious survival. The rebels fought with a ferocity that stunned the Romans. Jerusalem, their holy city, became a fortress. The war was brutal, protracted, and devastating for Judea. The eventual Roman victory, culminating in the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, was a cataclysmic event that has echoed through history. The Judean revolt was a stark reminder that military might alone could not force a people to abandon their identity. It exposed the limits of Roman power and the deep cultural fault lines running through the empire. So, what does all this mean when we put it together? The uprisings in Gaul, Hispania, and Judea were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a larger disease. The cracks in imperial authority were widening into chasms. The very structure that made the empire strong, its vast size and its powerful provincial armies, was now becoming its greatest vulnerability. The loyalty of the legions, once sworn to the Senate and people of Rome, was now up for grabs, often going to the general who promised the most gold and glory. This period of turmoil marked a fundamental shift. The central government in Rome could no longer take the obedience of its provinces for granted. It was constantly looking over its shoulder, wary of the next ambitious general or the next rebellious province. The illusion of a single, unified, and peaceful Roman world was shattering. The empire was being pulled apart from within, not by external enemies, but by its own internal contradictions. The system was breaking down. This era of revolt and unrest set the stage for the crises that would follow, a long and slow decline that would eventually lead to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It's a powerful lesson in how even the greatest empires are not immune to internal decay, and the timeless human desires for power, freedom, and identity. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a turbulent chapter of Roman history. It's a complex story, and we've only scratched the surface. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next episode. We love hearing from you, so drop your questions and thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our journey through the tumultuous life of Nero. Today, we delve into one of the most shocking and debated episodes of his reign, the death of his empress, Poppaea Sabina. A woman of immense beauty and ambition, Poppaea's end was as dramatic as her life, leaving a dark stain on Nero's already controversial legacy. According to the historian Tacitus, the end came in the year 65 AD. Poppaea was pregnant with her second child, and an argument erupted between her and Nero. The details are murky, but the account that has echoed through the centuries is a brutal one. In a fit of rage, Nero allegedly kicked his pregnant wife, leading to her death. Cassius Dio, another historian, corroborates this story, painting a picture of a domestic dispute that spiraled into a horrific tragedy. Imagine the scene in the imperial palace. The news of the empress's death would have spread like wildfire, first in hushed whispers, then in open rumor. Was it an accident, a moment of uncontrolled fury, or something more sinister? The official story, of course, would have been one of accidental death or illness, but the people of Rome, already wary of their emperor, were quick to believe the worst. The air would have been thick with suspicion, grief mingling with fear. This wasn't just the death of an empress. It was a sign of the emperor's unraveling, a confirmation of the violence simmering just beneath the surface of his glamorous court. Nero's reaction to Poppaea's death was anything but ordinary. It was a spectacle of grief so extreme, so theatrical that it only fueled more speculation. He reportedly delivered a lavish eulogy from the rostra, praising her beauty and her divine fortune in bearing him a child. I wept openly, a display of sorrow that some saw as genuine, and others as a performance to mask his guilt. He refused the traditional Roman custom of cremation. Instead, in a move that broke with all precedent, he had Poppaea's body embalmed with a fortune in spices and perfumes, a practice associated with the pharaohs of Egypt, not the emperors of Rome. This act of mummification was just the beginning of his bizarre tribute. Her body was laid to rest in the mausoleum of Augustus, an honor reserved for the most revered members of the imperial family. But Nero went even further. He had Poppaea officially deified. She was now Diva Poppaea, Augusta, a goddess to be worshipped. Temples were planned in her honor, and her image was elevated to that of a divine being. Was this the desperate act of a man consumed by remorse, trying to elevate the woman he had destroyed to the heavens? Or was it the ultimate act of a megalomaniac, turning his victim into a goddess of his own creation? The psychological implications are fascinating. If he did kill her, this deification could be seen as a profound act of denial. By making her a goddess, he placed her beyond the realm of mortal suffering. Perhaps absolving himself in his own mind, he could worship her memory without confronting the grim reality of her end. He even found a young boy named Sporus, who bore a striking resemblance to Poppaea, had him castrated, and then married him in a public ceremony, dressing him in the empress's clothes. It was a macabre attempt to recreate what he had lost, a ghostly echo of the woman he both loved and, according to the sources, destroyed. This chapter of Nero's life is a potent mix of love, violence, grief, and madness. Poppaea's death marks a turning point, pushing Nero further into isolation and paranoia. The rumors solidified public opinion against him, and his extravagant, almost manic grief did little to help his case. He had lost not just his wife and unborn child, but also a key political ally. Poppaea had been a significant influence at court, and her absence created a vacuum that was soon filled by less trustworthy advisors. The story of Poppaea's end is a powerful reminder of the brutality that often lay behind the marble facades of ancient Rome. It's a human tragedy played out on an imperial stage, a tale of passion and power that ends in death and a strange, almost obsessive deification. What do you think? Was Nero a grieving husband or a guilty murderer trying to rewrite history? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive into one of history's most compelling and tragic stories. If you found this fascinating, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the dramatic lives of the past. Your support helps us continue to bring these stories to light. Until next time, stay curious. Hello and welcome back to our journey through the annals of Rome. Today, we delve into a chapter filled with shadows, whispers, and the deadly dance of conspiracy. This is the story of a city holding its breath as the very foundations of power began to crack under the Emperor Nero. The year is 65 AD. Nero's reign, which began with promise, has descended into a spectacle of extravagance, cruelty, and paranoia. The Roman elite, the senators, the philosophers, and the soldiers, who once saw him as a beacon of a new golden age, now saw a tyrant. The discontent that had been simmering for years was about to boil over. In the heart of Rome, a plot was taking shape, one that would aim to topple the emperor himself. This was the Pisonian conspiracy, named after its central figure, Gaius Calpurnius Piso. Piso was a man of considerable charm, wealth, and influence. A senator from an illustrious family, he was seen by many as a viable, more stable alternative to the erratic Nero. He wasn't a military firebrand or a radical revolutionary. He was the establishment's choice, a man who could restore the dignity of the Roman state. The conspiracy that formed around him was a veritable who's who of Roman high society. It included senators, equestrians, and even members of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards. These weren't just disgruntled politicians. They were poets, writers, and thinkers who believed Rome deserved better. The plan was audacious. They intended to assassinate Nero during the Circus Maximus Games, a public spectacle where the emperor would be a vulnerable and accessible target. The idea was to strike him down in front of the Roman people, a symbolic act to end his tyranny. Once Nero was dead, Piso would be escorted by the Praetorian Guard to their camp and proclaimed the new emperor. It was a high-stakes gamble, with the fate of the empire hanging in the balance. The conspirators were bound by a shared fear of Nero and a desperate hope for a new beginning. They met in secret, their conversations hushed, their plans meticulously laid. Every detail was considered, from the choice of assassin to the signal for the attack. But as is so often the case with conspiracies, the greatest threat comes not from the enemy, but from within. The plot was a complex web of individuals, and the more people involved, the greater the risk of betrayal. The fatal crack appeared from an unexpected quarter. A freedwoman named Epicharis, who was privy to the plot, grew impatient with the conspirators' delays. She tried to enlist a naval commander named Valesius Proculus into the conspiracy, believing his resentment towards Nero would make him a willing participant. However, Proculus saw a different opportunity. Instead of joining the plot, he reported everything he had heard to Nero. At first, Nero's inner circle was skeptical. The information was vague, and Epicharis, when arrested, denied everything. Even under torture, she revealed no names. But the seed of suspicion had been planted in Nero's mind. The conspiracy, however, continued to unravel. A senator named Flavius Scaevonis, one of the key plotters, made a series of careless mistakes. He drafted his will, gave his dagger to a freedman to be sharpened, and prepared bandages, as if for a wound. His freedman, Malicious, grew suspicious and terrified. Urged on by his wife, Melicius went straight to Nero's gardens and revealed everything he knew, naming Scaevonis and another conspirator. The dam had burst. Scaevonis was arrested and, under the threat of torture, he crumbled. He implicated others, and they, in turn, implicated more. A chain reaction of accusations and confessions began, fueled by fear and the hope of clemency. Nero's paranoia, always simmering beneath the surface, erupted into a full-blown inferno. The city of Rome was gripped by terror. Arrests were made day and night. No one felt safe. A casual remark, a past association, a rival's accusationing of these could lead to a death sentence. The trials were swift and merciless, little more than a formality before the inevitable verdict. Nero saw conspirators behind every column, traitors in every shadow. The purge was brutal and extensive. The man at the center of the plot, Piso, upon learning of its discovery, chose to take his own life rather than face the humiliation of a public trial and execution. But his death did not quell Nero's thirst for vengeance. The emperor used the conspiracy as a pretext to eliminate anyone he disliked or feared, whether they were involved or not. Among the most prominent victims was a name that echoed through the halls of philosophy and statesmanship: Lucius Aeneas Seneca. Seneca the Younger had been Nero's tutor, his guide, his chief advisor during the early, more prosperous years of his reign. He was a Stoic philosopher, a playwright, and one of the wealthiest men in Rome. He had tried to steer the young emperor towards virtue and moderation, but as Nero grew older, he increasingly resented Seneca's influence and moral lectures. Seneca had retired from public life several years prior, hoping to live out his days in quiet contemplation, but his name was inevitably dragged into the conspiracy. It's unclear if Seneca was truly involved. Some sources say he was, others that he was merely a scapegoat for Nero's long-held resentment. But for Nero, the accusation was enough. Hatiban was sent to Seneca's villa outside Rome with a grim message. The emperor demanded his death. Seneca received the news with the stoic calm he had preached his entire life. Surrounded by his wife and friends, he accepted his fate not as a punishment, but as a release from the tyranny he could no longer influence. According to the historian Tacitus, he tried to comfort those weeping around him, reminding them of the philosophical principles they had studied together. He embraced his wife, Paulina, but when she declared her wish to die with him, he tried to dissuade her. Nevertheless, she insisted. They both opened their veins. Seneca's death was prolonged and agonizing. Due to his age and simple diet, the blood flowed too slowly. He endured immense pain with remarkable fortitude, even dictating his final thoughts to a scribe. To hasten the end, he was moved into a steam bath, where he finally succumbed to suffocation. His death was a tragic and poignant end to a life dedicated to wisdom and virtue, a stark symbol of the darkness that had consumed Nero's court. He was forced to die by the very student he had tried to mold into a philosopher king. The failed Pisonian conspiracy had a profound and lasting impact. It solidified Nero's tyranny, transforming his paranoia into a state-sanctioned reign of terror. The purge that followed decimated the Roman aristocracy, wiping out many of the most respected and capable men of the generation. It created a power vacuum that was filled by more sycophantic and ruthless individuals who encouraged the emperor's worst impulses. The hope for a return to republican values or a more benevolent form of rule was extinguished, replaced by a climate of fear and submission. The events of 65 AD were a dark prelude to the final, chaotic years of Nero's reign, setting the stage for the civil wars that would follow his eventual downfall. The whispers of conspiracy had faded, replaced by the silence of the grave, and Rome was left to reckon with the monster it had created. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of Rome's most dramatic chapters. The story of Nero is a powerful reminder of how quickly power can corrupt and how fragile even the greatest empires can be. If you found this interesting, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more stories from history. We'd love to have you with us as we continue our journey. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our series on the life of Nero. Today, in Chapter 17, we delve into the darkest period of his reign, a tyrant in isolation. The once promising young emperor was now spiraling into a vortex of paranoia and cruelty, a transformation that would forever cement his notorious legacy. Imagine Rome's city holding its breath, where the whispers in the Senate could be a death sentence. Loyalty was a currency that devalued by the hour. This was Nero's world, a stage where he was both the star and the executioner. As Nero's grip on power tightened, so did the shadows of suspicion in his mind. The Pisonian conspiracy, though suppressed, had left a deep and festering wound on his psyche. He saw phantoms in every corner, traitors in every friendly face. This paranoia wasn't just a fleeting mood. It became the very lens through which he viewed his empire. His closest advisors, men like Seneca and Burrus, were long gone, replaced by a vacuum of trust that Nero filled with fear. He began to believe that everyone, from the highest-ranking senator to the common soldier, was plotting his downfall. This intense suspicion soon curdled into outright cruelty. Nero initiated a series of purges that sent a chilling wave of terror through Rome's elite. It was a systematic elimination of anyone he deemed a threat, whether real or imagined. The criteria for execution became terrifyingly broad. A noble with a distinguished lineage, a potential rival, a popular general, a threat to his authority, someone who failed to applaud his artistic performances with sufficient enthusiasm, a personal enemy. The accusations were often baseless, the trials a mere formality. The message was clear. Absolute loyalty was demanded, and anything less was punishable by death. Among the many victims were some of Rome's most respected figures. Remember Gaius Calpurnius Piso, the man at the center of the conspiracy? His fate was sealed. But Nero's vengeance didn't stop there. The philosopher Seneca, his former tutor, was forced to take his own life. The poet Lucan, ancien friend, met the same end. Noble families who had served Rome for generations were systematically dismantled. Their properties were confiscated, their names erased from public record, and their lives extinguished. These weren't just political maneuvers. They were personal vendettas played out on a national scale. Nero seemed to take a grim satisfaction in orchestrating the downfall of those he had once admired or envied. While the Roman elite trembled, Nero retreated further into his own world, a gilded cage of art and governance. The tedious two-day business of running an empire held little interest for him. He delegated responsibilities to men who were either sycophants or equally corrupt, leaving the administration of the vast Roman territories to falter. The machinery of the state began to grind and stall, but Nero was blissfully unaware, or perhaps simply didn't care. His true passion, his obsession, was his art. He poured imperial funds into lavish theatrical productions, musical competitions, and grandiose building projects. His days were not spent reviewing military reports or judicial appeals, but practicing his lyre, composing poetry, and rehearsing for his next public performance. He saw himself not as an emperor, but as a supreme artist, a divine talent that the world was privileged to witness. The city of Rome became his personal stage, and its citizens a captive audience. He demanded their applause, their adulation, their recognition of his genius. This detachment created a bizarre and dangerous reality. While Nero was lost in his artistic fantasies, the empire was fraying at the edges. Discontent was growing in the provinces. The treasury was being drained to fund his opulent lifestyle, and the military was becoming restless. Nero's palace, the Roma Aurea, or Golden House, became a symbol of this disconnect. It was an impossibly luxurious complex built on the ashes of the Great Fire, a monument to his own glory while many of his people remained displaced. He dined on exotic delicacies, surrounded himself with decadent luxury, and indulged in every pleasure imaginable, all while his empire teetered on the brink. This period of isolation and tyranny wasn't just about political purges. It was a profound psychological unraveling. Nero had cut himself off from reality, insulated by a wall of fear and flattery. He had silenced every dissenting voice, leaving only the echo of his own pronouncements. He was the most powerful man in the world, yet he was profoundly alone, trapped in a golden palace with only his suspicions and his lyre for company. The tyrant was no longer just a ruler inflicting cruelty upon others. He was a man consumed by his own demons, a monarch lost in a maze of his own making. The consequences of this detachment would be catastrophic. The neglect of state affairs and the alienation of the military and the Senate were creating a perfect storm of rebellion. The man who saw himself as a god of the stage was about to face a final act he had not written, a tragedy where he would be the central figure. His isolation was not a fortress, but a prison, and the walls were about to come crashing down. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Nero's reign of terror. It's a chilling reminder of how unchecked power and paranoia can lead to ruin. If you found this chapter compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion to Nero's story. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Have you ever wondered what it takes to topple an emperor? For Nero, it wasn't just palace intrigue or a single assassin's blade. It was a firestorm that erupted hundreds of miles away, in the heart of Gaul, and it was sparked by a man named Gaius Julius Vin. Picture this. The year is 68 AD. Nero's reign, once filled with artistic ambition and public spectacle, has curdled into paranoia and tyranny. The treasury is empty, the people are restless, and the elite are terrified. From the provinces, Rome's governors and generals watch with growing unease. They see an emperor detached from reality, more concerned with his lyre than his legions. The empire is a powder keg, and Vindex is about to light the fuse. Who was this Vindex? He wasn't some barbarian chieftain. He was a Roman citizen of Aquitanian royal descent, the governor of Gallia. He was educated, influential, and, most importantly, fed up. He saw Nero as a disgracia, bad lyre player, and who was destroying the very fabric of Rome. Vindex decided someone had to act. He began writing secret letters to other provincial governors, testing the waters, seeking allies for a cause he called the liberation of the human race. His call to arms was a direct challenge to Nero's authority. Vindex wasn't just complaining, he was actively raising an army, a force of Gallic tribesmen numbering in the tens of thousands. He declared Nero a public enemy. This was unprecedented. A provincial governor was openly rebelling, not for personal gain, but in the name of restoring Roman dignity. He wasn't aiming for the throne himself. He was looking for a worthy candidate to replace the theatrical tyrant. Back in Rome, the news of Vindex's revolt was initially dismissed by Nero. Another provincial squabble, perhaps. He famously boasted that he would deal with the Gauls by simply singing to them. But as reports flooded in about the scale of the uprising, panic began to set in. The Senate was terrified, and Nero's nonchalant attitude quickly evaporated. He returned to Rome, but his response was erratic and bizarre. He proposed bizarre new weapons and held musical contests, seemingly unable to grasp the gravity of the situation. The key to this entire crisis lay not just with Vindex, but with the other powerful generals stationed across the empire. Would they join the rebellion, or would they crush it to prove their loyalty to Nero? The man Vindex had in mind was Servius Sulpicius Galba, the elderly and respected governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. Galba was a veteran commander from an old, noble family, the complete opposite of Nero. Galba was hesitant. He was 71 years old and knew the risks. Declaring against a reigning emperor was a death sentence. If you failed, 4 weeks, he debated. He had Vindex's letters. He heard the whispers from his own advisors, and he saw the writing on the wall for Nero's regime. The tide of opinion among the military elite was turning. The confidence that had sustained Nero, the belief in his divine right and his power, was crumbling. The generals were no longer afraid of Nero. They were afraid of being on the wrong side of history. The turning point came when Galba discovered that Nero had secretly ordered his assassination. Now, it was a matter of survival. On April 2nd, 68 AD, Galba stood before his legions. He didn't declare himself emperor. That was too bold. Instead, in a stroke of political genius, he declared himself the legate of the Senate and the Roman people. He was no longer Nero's governor. He was the servant of Rome itself, aligning himself with the very heart of the Republic's traditions. With Galba's declaration, the rebellion gained a credible, powerful leader. It was no longer just a Gallic uprising. It was a full-blown Roman civil war. But Vindex's own part in the story was about to come to a tragic and abrupt end. The commander of the armies in Germania Superior, Lucius Virginius Rufus, marched to confront Vindex. Rufus's position was ambiguous. Was he loyal to Nero? Was he acting on his own ambition? His legions, however, saw the Gauls under Vindex as a traditional enemy. Near the city of Asantio Morande Bisancun, the two armies met. Despite attempts by Vindex and Rufus to negotiate, their soldiers clashed. Vindex's tribal levy, though numerous, was no match for the disciplined Roman legions. His army was slaughtered, and seeing his dream of a liberated Rome shattered on the battlefield, Vindex took his own life. It seemed like a victory for Nero. The instigator of the rebellion was dead, but it was a hollow victory. The fire Vindex had started was now an inferno. Virginius Rufus's own troops, fresh from their victory, tried to proclaim him emperor. He refused, steadfast in his belief that only the Senate had the right to choose an emperor. This act, while noble, only created a bigger power vacuum. With Vindex gone, all eyes turned to Galba in Spain. He was now the sole figurehead of the opposition, The news of Vindex's defeat was a terrifying blow, and Galba nearly gave up, retreating into despair. But then, something incredible happened. Nero's own Praetorian Guard in Rome, the very bodyguards meant to protect him, turned against him. Bribed by their prefect, they declared their allegiance to Galba. The Senate, seeing the emperor was now defenseless, finally found its courage. They declared Nero a public enemy and recognized Galba as the new emperor. Nero fled the city, his power vanishing overnight, hiding in a freedman's villa with his enemies closing in. The last Julio Claudian emperor met his pathetic end, reportedly uttering the famous last words, "What an artist dies in me." So, what is the legacy of Vindex's revolt? He failed in his battle, he lost his life, and he never saw the new emperor he championed to take power. But he was the catalyst. He was the first one brave enough to stand up and say enough. His rebellion exposed the fatal weakness of Nero's regime and shattered the illusion of imperial invincibility. It empowered other generals, particularly Galba, to make their move and gave the Senate the opening it needed to act. The death of Nero plunged Rome into the chaotic year of the four emperors, but it all started with one man's defiant stand in Gaul. Gaius Julius Vindex may have lost his war, but in the end, he won. He set in motion the events that brought down a tyrant and forever changed the course of the Roman Empire. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back to ancient Rome. If you enjoyed this story and want to uncover more epic moments from history, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what you think about Vindex's bold move. We'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome back to our series on the Roman emperors. Today, we've reached a dramatic and pivotal moment in Roman history, the fall of Nero. In our last episode, we saw the Vindex revolt in Gaul ignite a firestorm of opposition. While that specific rebellion was crushed, the embers of discontent were glowing red-hot across the empire, and now they were about to engulf Rome itself. The year is 68 CE. The atmosphere in Rome is thick with tension. 4 years, Nero's extravagance, his artistic and his brutal purges of the senatorial class have created a deep well of resentment. The Pisonian conspiracy a few years prior showed just how fragile his grip on power was, but his response was swift and merciless. However, the rebellion of Vindex, followed by the crucial support of Galba in Spain, changed everything. The legions were turning against him. Back in Rome, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own elite bodyguards, were the key to holding the city. Their loyalty was bought, not earned, and their prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, saw an opportunity. He was an ambitious man who began to secretly promise the guards a massive donativa, cash bonus if they would abandon Nero and declare their allegiance to God. For soldiers who had grown tired of Nero's theatrics and perhaps feared being dragged down with him, the promise of cold, hard cash was an offer they couldn't refuse. While Nero was at a banquet, news arrived that the armies in Spain and Germany had renounced him. He panicked, knocking over the table and shattering 2 priceless crystal cups. His first instinct was to flee, perhaps to Egypt, to throw himself on the mercy of the eastern provinces. But his plans were chaotic and contradictory. He considered addressing the people, begging for their forgiveness, or even leading a military charge himself. His advisors, however, knew the situation was hopeless. The city was turning against him. As day turned to night, Nero found himself utterly alone. His guards had melted away. His palace staff had deserted him, taking even the bedding and a small box of poison he had prepared. He wandered the empty, cavernous halls of his golden house, calling out for anyone, but only echoes answered. In a desperate state, he went to the homes of his few remaining friends, but the doors were barred. No one wanted to be associated with a falling emperor. He returned to his chambers to find even his last bodyguards had vanished. The man who once commanded the known world was now a fugitive in his own city. It was then that his freedman, Finn, offered him refuge at his humble villa, just a few miles outside Rome. This was his only option. So, in the dead of night, the Emperor of Rome, disguised in a drab cloak, his face partially covered to avoid recognition, mounted a horse and fled the capital. The journey was terrifying. The small party had to navigate the dark, unfamiliar roads. A minor earthquake shook the ground, a fittingly ominous sign. They overheard soldiers on the road cursing Nero's name and praising Galba. At one point, his horse shied at the sight of a nearby corpse, causing the cloak to fall from his face. A passing retired soldier recognized him, but said nothing, a chilling reminder of how far he had fallen. To avoid being seen on the main road, they had to dismount and make their way through a thicket of reeds and thorns, crawling on their hands and knees. Finn urged him to hide in a sandpit, but Nero, with a flicker of his old imperial pride, refused, saying he would not be buried alive. Finally, they reached the rear wall of Finn's villa. They had to create a small opening for him to crawl through. Once inside, exhausted, thirsty, and covered in mud, he was offered a simple piece of bread and some water. He rejected the bread but drank the murky water, remarking with grim irony, "So, this is Nero's celebrated chilled water." He collapsed onto a simple cot. The contrast, with the silken beds of his golden house, almost too much to bear. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the Senate had convened. Emboldened by Nero's flight and the Praetorian Guard's defection, they acted swiftly. They officially declared Nero a hostis, an enemy of the state. This was a death sentence. It meant that any Roman citizen could kill him on sight without trial and be rewarded for it. A dispatch was sent out to find and arrest him, with orders to bring him back to Rome for the traditional punishment, to be flogged to death in the public forum. A messenger reached the villa with this dreadful news. Nero knew his time was up. He paced back and forth, muttering to himself, torn between ending his own life and waiting for the inevitable, humiliating capture. He ordered his companions to start digging a grave for him, sizing it up against his own body, and demanded they bring water and wood for his funeral pyre. All the while, he was weeping, lamenting his fate. He pulled out 2 daggers he had brought with him, tested their sharpness, and then put them away again, claiming the fatal moment had not yet come. He begged one of his companions to kill himself first, to set an example, but no one would. He was paralyzed by fear. To live on is a disgrace, a shame, he cried, but still, he could not act. His entire life had been a performance, and now, in his final scene, he had forgotten his lines. Then, they heard the sound of hoofbeats. The soldiers sent by the Senate were approaching. The noise shocked him into action. With a sudden burst of clarity, he placed a dagger to his throat. Pateventen, his courage failed him. It was his loyal freedman, Epaphroditus, who provided the final push, helping him drive the blade home. As he lay dying, the first of the soldiers, a centurion, burst into the room. Seeing the emperor bleeding out, he rushed to his side, pretending he was there to help, trying to staunch the wound with his cloak. But it was too late. Nero looked up at him, and with his last breath, whispered the famous, haunting words, "Too late. This is fidelity." His eyes then bulged and glazed over in a stare so horrifying that all who saw it were terrified. And so, in June of 68 CE, at the age of just 30, Nero, the last of the Julio Claudian dynasty, was dead. His reign, which had begun with such promise, ended in a squalid villa. A suicide born of terror and despair. In his final moments, as he lamented his fate, he is said to have repeatedly uttered another famous line qualis artifex, "What an artist dies in me." It is a phrase that perfectly encapsulates his entire life. A man who saw himself as a grand performer on the world stage, but who in the end was consumed by his own delusions, leaving behind a legacy of tyranny, chaos, and a Rome on the brink of civil war. His death marked the end of an era. The family of Augustus was gone. The ensuing power vacuum would plunge the Roman Empire into the tumultuous year of the 4 emperors. A brutal civil war that would test the very foundations of the state. But that is a story for our next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me for this dramatic conclusion to the life of Nero. It is a powerful reminder of how quickly fortunes can turn and how absolute power can lead to absolute ruin. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode, where we dive into the chaos that followed. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on the Roman emperors. Today, we arrive at the final chapter of a story that has been filled with drama, ambition, and tragedy. We're exploring Chapter 20. The afterlife of a legend, focusing on the shadow cast by Nero long after his death. His end brought a collective sigh of relief across Rome, but what followed was far more complex than simple celebration. Nero's death in 68 AD plunged the Roman Empire into chaos. The immediate reaction in the capital was one of sheer relief. The Senate, which had lived in fear of his unpredictable wrath, declared him a public enemy. The elites, whose wealth he had plundered and whose ranks he had decimated, celebrated the end of his tyranny. For a moment, it seemed as though a dark cloud had finally lifted. But this relief was short-lived. The power vacuum he left behind triggered the infamous Year of the Four Emperors, a brutal civil war that tore the empire apart. In the midst of this bloodshed and uncertainty, a strange and unexpected sentiment began to surface. Nostalgia. It sounds bizarre, doesn't it? Nostalgia for a tyrant, but for the common people of Rome, the plebeians, Nero's reign hadn't been all bad. They remembered the grand spectacles, the generous handouts of grain and cash, the public works that gave them jobs, and the relative peace that had characterized much of his rule. Compared to the chaos of ambitious generals marching on Rome, Nero's decadent but stable court started to look almost appealing. People began to quietly remember the good times, filtering out the bad. This sentiment reveals a crucial truth about power. A ruler's legacy is rarely monolithic. For every senator who cursed Nero's name, there was likely a common citizen who fondly remembered the festivals he threw. This undercurrent of nostalgia gave rise to one of the most fascinating phenomena in Roman history: the myth of Nero's return. Shortly after his death, rumors began to circulate that he wasn't really gone. Some claimed he had escaped, fleeing to the eastern provinces where he had always been more popular. The stories varied, but the core idea was the same. Nero was alive and would one day return to reclaim his throne. It was a powerful fantasy, a kind of political messianism for the Roman world. People wanted to believe that the larger-than-life emperor, the one who had entertained and astonished them, could not be vanquished so easily. It was a testament to the sheer force of his personality and the deep impression he had left on the public consciousness. This belief wasn't just idle gossip. It had real-world consequences. Over the next 2 decades, at least 3 different empires, known as pseudo-Neros, emerged, each claiming to be the returned emperor. The first appeared just a year after Nero's death, gathering a small following of desperate and hopeful people before being captured and executed. Another surfaced during the reign of Titus, gaining support in Asia Minor and almost sparking a war with the who, for their own political reasons, seemed willing to back his claim. A third appeared 20 years after Nero's death. Each time one was debunked, the myth itself seemed to grow stronger, adapting and persisting. It showed how deeply the idea of Nero was embedded in the popular imagination, serving as a beacon of hope for some and a symbol of potential rebellion for others. As the years turned into decades and the Julio Claudian dynasty faded into memory, Nero's image began to transform. For the new ruling elites, and for historians like Tacitus and who wrote the histories that would define him for centuries, he became the ultimate archetype of the bad emperor. They used him as a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when absolute power is given to a man corrupted by decadence, cruelty, and unchecked ego. They painted him as a matricide, an arsonist, and a persecutor, meticulously documenting his every excess. This version of Nero Tyranny became the official story, cemented in the historical record. He was the monster at the end of the Julio Claudian line, the embodiment of everything the new, more stable dynasties defined themselves against. For early Christians, Nero's legacy took on an even darker and more profound meaning. According to tradition, the first major Roman persecution of Christians happened on his watch. Following the Great Fire of Rome, he became, in their eyes, the first great enemy of the faith. In the Book of Revelation, some scholars believe the infamous number of the beast, 666, is a coded reference to Nero Caesar. He was transformed from a historical tyrant into a figure of apocalyptic evil, an agent of darkness, and a precursor to the Antichrist. This religious interpretation ensured his infamy would far outlast the Roman Empire itself, making his name synonymous with persecution and godlessness for millennia. Yet, even with this overwhelmingly negative reputation, another, more nuanced view of Nero always lingered. This was the idea of Nero as a figure of lost potential. He wasn't born a monster. He was a young man who ascended to the throne with great promise, guided in his early years by respected thinkers like Seneca. He was a lover of the arts, a musician, an actor, a poet, and an architect with a genuine passion for Greek culture. His early reign, the famous asterisk, Quinquennium Neronis asterisk, was considered a golden age of good governance. So, where did it all go wrong? This question has haunted historians and artists for centuries. Was he a victim of his own unchecked power, a talented but flawed individual, crushed by the impossible weight of the emperors? Or was he simply a man whose personal appetites were incompatible with the responsibilities of rule? This duality is what makes Nero such an enduringly fascinating character. He is both the tyrant and the artist, the monster and the man of potential. He represents the terrifying intersection of absolute power and human frailty. Did his artistic ambitions make him a bad emperor? Or was he a bad emperor who just happened to be an artist? There's no easy answer, and that complexity is why his story continues to be told and retold. He forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, morality, and the very nature of history itself. Who gets to write the story? The powerful historians who despise a ruler, or the common people who enjoyed his festivals? In the end, Nero's afterlife is a testament to the power of narrative. His physical reign lasted less than 14 years, but his reign in the cultural imagination has lasted for 2,000. He has been a villain, a symbol of decadence, an antichrist, a tragic figure, and even, for some, a kind of folk hero. The real Nero, the man of flesh and blood, is buried deep beneath layers of myth, propaganda, and what remains is a legend, a powerful, contradictory, an immortal symbol of Rome at its most brilliant and its most terrifying. He's a ghost that still haunts the Western world, a reminder of the delicate line between greatness and monstrosity. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the legacy of Nero. It's a story that truly shows how history is never really over. If you found this interesting, please consider liking the video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the fascinating world of ancient Rome. We'd love to have you with us for the next chapter. See you next time.